video, we're doing some basic dyeing in our prepared indigo dye vat. The video was filmed over a 4-day period, with many dye projects completed during that time. By the 4th day, the color was almost gone and the results were very pale. Here's the story. For this project, you'll need a prepared indigo dye vat. Our dye was mixed from a kit in a 5-gallon bucket with a sealable lid. Sealing protects the dye from oxidizing and enables us to use the dye vat over a period of several days or weeks. Some additional supplies you'll need include bucket of water for soaking and rinsing, tray to hold the dyed fabric, paddle for stirring, latex gloves, drop cloths. For safety, never use the same utensils for both dyeing and preparing food. Let's get started. First, gather supplies and prepare your work area. Indigo stains, so it is recommended to protect work surfaces with drop cloths. We have an assortment of fabric and fiber for dyeing: cotton dish towels, silk scarf, linen and cotton fabric pieces, and wool yarn. The fabric was scoured to remove impurities that might prevent the dye from bonding to the fiber, but there is no need for mordanting. You can weigh the fabric to get an idea of how long your dye vat will last. The kit dyes up to 15 pounds of fabric. However, you may want to dip the fabric multiple times to achieve deeper shades. This uses more dye, so 15 pounds is just a guideline. I decided I would keep dyeing until there was no color left. I was curious to see the range of colors produced. To prepare the fabric for dyeing, add warm water to a bucket. Soak the prepared fabric in water. Squeeze out excess water and air from the fabric before submerging into the dye. Keep in mind these guidelines when working with the dye vat. Store the vat at room temperature. Keep the vat as oxygen-free as possible. Remove any skin or bloom from the surface. Don't let the fabric drop to the bottom of the vat where dye sediment collects. For safety, keep out of reach of children and animals. Always store the dye with the lid sealed. About 20 minutes before a dye session, stir the dye vat in one direction for a few minutes to redistribute the dye sediment. Reverse direction slowly at the end as you draw the paddle out of the vat. Reseal the vat and let it rest while you prepare your dye project. This is a good time to soak your fabric. The basic steps for dyeing: remove the lid from the vat. Squeeze water and air out of the fabric. While squeezing, submerge the fabric into the dye vat and hold for a minute or two. Remove the fabric from the vat slowly, squeezing it just below the surface as you do. Set aside the fabric to oxidize. Either cover the dye vat or continue to the next piece. Once an item has oxidized, you can either dip it again to achieve a darker shade or rinse the fabric and hang it to dry. My dye vat seemed very blue rather than the yellow-green color that was described. The vat had a metallic skin over the surface, as well as a bloom or clump of bubbles on the surface. This is from oxidation. It was easily moved to the side or scooped out of the dye vat. On the first day, I dyed 6 cotton dish towels. 2 towels were dipped once, 2 were dipped twice, and 3 were dipped 3 times. While squeezing, slowly submerge the fabric into the dye vat. Gently swish the fabric from side to side in the dye, just under the surface. At first I used thick rubber gloves, but they were very cumbersome. Later I switched to latex gloves. They were light and flexible and much easier to use. I wasn't sure how long to keep the fabric in the vat, but I found that a minute or 2 per dip worked well. Keep in mind that the color appears much darker when wet. When ready, slowly remove the fabric, squeezing out the excess dye. Then open up the fabric, exposing it to oxygen. Place the fabric in the tray. As oxygen hits the fabric, the color turns from yellow-green to blue. This process is so exciting and never gets old. First the vibrant green, then streaks of blue, then full blue. Science, art, and magic. After about 20 minutes, rinse the fabric in water and hang it to dry. Or you can repeat these steps for additional dips. I dipped 4 of the dish towels again, rinsed 2 and hung them to dry. I dipped the remaining 2 dish towels again, rinsed them and hung them to dry. The color was a deep blue. At first I didn't see the difference in color between the 3 dips. Later the difference became clearer. At the end of each dye session, gently stir the vat in a circular motion in one direction. Reverse direction slowly at the end as you draw the paddle out of the vat. Place the lid back into the vat and let settle for at least an hour before using the vat again. 4 days later, after lots of projects, the dye vat was running out of color. It looked blue, but was very watery. I decided to keep dyeing to see what would happen, using the same basic steps. Soaked the fabric in water and then squeezed out the excess. Dyed the fabric in the vat. I dipped the linen and cotton fabric once and the silk scarf twice. Surprisingly, the color was immediately pale blue. Moved the dyed fabric to the tray to rest. The fabric remained pale blue with no further transformation. After about 20 minutes, I rinsed the fabric in water and then hung it to dry. A lot of color was lost in the rinse, making me wonder if any dye molecules were bonding with the fabric. I repeated the same steps for the wool yarn, soaked in water, dipped one skein once, another one twice, and the third one 3 times. Rinsed and hung to dry. The hanging projects look so festive as they dry. The shades of deep indigo blue become more distinctive as the fabric dries. The shade from the spent dye vat is light denim blue. After everything was dyed and dried, I ran the fabric through the washing machine using a cold cycle and a mild textile detergent. Again, I hung the fabric to dry. Let's look at the outcome. The 6 dish towels were dyed when the dye vat was most potent. The 2 lighter towels were dipped once, the medium towels were dipped twice, and the darkest towels were dipped 3 times. The color is quite intense in all cases. The silk scarf was dipped 2 times when the dye was almost spent. The result is a very pale blue. It's quite delicate and lovely, but the photograph doesn't pick up the subtle color. As with the other silk scarves I've dyed, I have the scarf professionally dry cleaned. The linen and cotton fabric pieces were each dipped once when the dye was almost spent. I like the pale color, but it's not very even. I am curious about the yellow cast on the fabric pieces. They were all mordanted with oak gall last year. Would that explain it? Unfortunately, I forgot to dye yarn when the dye vat was at full strength. These skeins were dyed when the dye was almost spent. 1 skein was dipped once, another twice, and the third 3 times. For all 3, there wasn't enough dye to overcome the oatmeal color. According to kit instructions, it is safe to dispose of the dye vat by pouring it down the drain. Clean the bucket and utensils with dishwashing detergent or a powdered cleanser. Alternatively, you can purchase supplies to extend the dye vat, including pre-reduced indigo crystals, the reducing agent soda ash, and sodium hydrosulfite. In the next video, we'll see more of the projects that we tackled when the dye vat was still in its prime.